Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the event today. Good to see you all come out to see the Australian Protectionist Party welcome. We proudly present Mr. Graeme Campbell. Now, Graeme Campbell, I gather most of us in the room know who Graeme is. Graeme Campbell is the father of modern Australian nationalism. He's agreed to be the keynote speaker at the event today, organised by the Australian Protectionist Party in Perth today. Now, my name's Troy Ellis. I've been a thorn in the side of WA government and the judiciary for many years now, so he's been politically active for a long time, we all know that. Now he's been a strong advocate for the mining industry. He was first elected to the federal seat of Kalgoorlie in 1980 as a member of the Labor Party. Now Kalgoorlie was the largest federal electorate in the world. Now I do know that, it's incredible. It encompassed the Kimberley and Pilbara regions of Western Australia, so what a feat to run such a big electorate. Now, as well as the goldfields around Kalgoorlie and some wheat belt and agricultural areas of WA, a massive electorate. Now, Mr. Campbell was a member of the Hawke Labor government from 1983 to 91. Don't throw a chair at him. But as the Hawke government progressed, he found himself disagreeing more and more with their increasingly progressive, elitist and globalist direction. Here, Graeme, you're right. Now, hence he became known as something of a maverick. So am I then, in that case. He strongly opposed the Hawke government's proposed gold tax and crossed the floor to vote with the coalition in 1988 opposing it. Now, he was an outspoken opponent of mass immigration, here, Graeme, multiculturalism, environmental extremism, elitism, even better still, good on you. He was a vocal critic of the High Court's Mabo decision, and also he opposed the Australian sanctions against South Africa. Now, in 1994, he openly advocated in 2 by-elections in safe Liberal seats in Sydney that people vote for a new party named Australians Against Further Immigration. Fantastic. The following year, a book which Graeme Campbell co-authored entitled Australia Betrayed was published. The front cover has a map of Australia with a knife plunged through the middle of it. As many of us Australians are going to attest, that's how we feel too. Now, because of him constantly disagreeing with the increasingly progressive direction of the Hawke and the Keating Labor governments, but Mr. Campbell remained very popular in his own seat of Kalgoorlie, and he retained it as an independent at the 1996 federal election, which saw the Keating Labor government trounced by Liberal John Howard when Pauline Hanson made her famous maiden speech after being elected in 1996. Graeme Campbell praised her and can be heard saying, "Hear, a number of times in the background during her speech. How many politicians can actually go hear to someone who's on another team or another side to them? Not many. So good on you, Graeme. Now, sorry, I've got to interject for 1 minute too. Bradley asked me to wear a tie today too, but I'm wearing a tie because I didn't want to look too elitist. So, okay. Good tie at that. Now, in June 1996, Mr. Campbell had combined with Dennis McCormack, the head of Australians Against... But with the meteoric rise of Pauline Hanson and a new One Nation party in the 1990s, Campbell's New Australia First party struggled to attract the nationalist supporter base that it had hoped to. And Mr. Campbell was defeated in the Kalgoorlie seat by the Liberal Party. The Liberal Barry, is it Haas or Hass? Hass. At the 1998 federal election, or was that hassle? Was he a hassle to the constituents? Probably. By 2000, what's that? Sorry.
Hass.
Yeah. But 2001, Mr. Campbell had decided that if you can't beat them, join them, and he quit his own Australian First Party to become the new lead Senate candidate for One Nation in WA. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in getting elected again, as were his further attempts to get elected to the federal parliament as an independent. But, this is very important, there's always an important but here. But Graeme Campbell's legacy in Australian politics is profound. He was an old-style Labor man who cared about the battler and didn't like the new direction of Australian politics, what it took in the 80s and 90s. Either did I, and even when I was a kid. So when the majority of Australia's politicians had embraced free trade dogmatism, mass immigration including from Asia, multicultural and increasing globalisation and elitism in its many forms, Mr. Campbell was like a shining beacon in a dark tunnel, fighting to preserve traditional Australia as a sovereign nation of independent people. His speeches and writings have had considerable influence, and he is held in great esteem by many in the patriotic movement for his profound knowledge and wisdom and his politically incorrect common sense, which common sense isn't so common in Australia anymore, is it? So Mr Campbell's experience in politics, which included frequently travelling across vast areas of Western Australia, helped to give him unique insights into the issues facing the mining industry, Aborigines, farmers and pastoralist fishermen and people living in remote towns and communities. Mr Campbell is an inspiration to many Australian patriots and will be for many years to come. He deserves to be recognised as the father of modern Australian nationalism. Sorry to do that to you, Graeme, but that's what we're going to call you today. Australian Protectionist Party National Chairman Andrew Phillips says, Campbell is a most informative and eloquent speaker, a man of immense knowledge and very interesting to listen to. I wish I could be there, and he highly recommends you listen to Graeme. Now, today gives patriots in Western Australia an opportunity to do just that. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please remember that the Speaker, Graeme Campbell, today is not to be confused with the current Mayor of Broome, who is also called Graeme Campbell. So I don't know if he's better than Graeme, but possibly not today. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, could you please welcome to the podium Mr Graeme Campbell.
Well, thank you for that very eloquent introduction. Somebody once said that where you stand on an issue depends largely on where you sit, and I think that's very true. I just want to get out of the way one thing that gnaws at me continually. I would still be in Parliament today if it wasn't for Pauline Hanson. Now, Pauline Hanson, I wet nursed her in Parliament, absolutely wet nursed her. Her speech, her maiden speech, was a very good speech. It was written out of my office. I told her if she ran a candidate against me, I would lose. No, we'll give you the preferences, says Pauline. I said, Pauline, you can't deliver preferences. Exactly what happened. They didn't hand out cards, they put them under a rock and people grabbed them and found Pauline Hanson, voted down the ticket, back up the ticket. Unfortunately, I was above Pauline Hanson on the ticket. The Liberal Party was directly below them, and the Liberal Party got elected on her preferences. Had I got those preferences, I would have bolted in. But it's, the primary vote was very, very equally divided between us three major parties, the three main constituents, myself, Liberal and the Labor Party. Right, got that out the way. Now, I don't know what I was actually expected to talk about today, which is good, because it means I can talk about anything. I want to talk about the greatest danger facing Australia. Has anyone in the audience got any idea of the greatest danger facing Australia, what they think is? Yeah, Bradley.
Cultural Marxist-inspired political correctness.
That's certainly a very large part of it.
Complacency.
Complacency, yeah. Well, that's certainly a problem. I can give you a bit of a hint. The Democrat Party in America, I got sent a flyer in the mail the other day following our trip to America. They see the three major factors in this coming election in America as equal rights for bisexuals, global warming, and I forgot what the other was, but it was equally gratuitous. And I thought, well, the United States must be in pretty good nick if they're the big issues. And my visit to the United States ensured me that that wasn't the case, or isn't the case. I think the biggest threat to Australia is the defence of Australia, with all those applications. Australia is a very easy country to defend. We've been brought up on this, big empty country, very vulnerable. That emptiness is what makes us very secure. No matter how we erode it, If we have the proper armaments, we can defend Australia. But every person in Australia could have their own nuclear weapon, and it wouldn't make any difference if you don't control the fifth column within you. Now, statistics say that if 10% of the community believes in something other than Australian sovereignty, you will lose. And events in history have shown us that. And this is one of the reasons I've always opposed multiculturalism. Multiculturalism displaced the policy which built Australia, which was assimilation. And I have a view that if one comes to Australia and one doesn't want to assimilate into Australia, then you have to ask, why are you here? Now, what the government did when it saw that assimilation wasn't working in some areas, they decided on this multiculturalism, which proclaims that all cultures are equal. They're just different, but they're all equal. Well, that is absolute nonsense. Our culture is among the best in the world. I certainly don't know of any better, but above all, it's our culture. And I think it's outrageous the way the government, without any mandate, have brought in this policy. There was never any mandate. No party ever said, oh, at the next election we're going to bring in multiculturalism. They just forced it on us. It was easy because both parties agreed. And I think the results of multiculturalism have been disastrous. If you had a poll tomorrow throughout Australia, do you want multiculturalism or return to assimilation? Assimilation will win. But as we go on, that becomes more and more in doubt, because multiculturalism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I have some peculiar reading habits. I've read the Quran a couple of times. In fact, I reread it again 2 years ago because it was 20 years since I'd read it, and I thought it can't be as bad as I remember. It was. My memory's not that bad.
Graeme, is that how your hair fell out?
Yeah. So, I think people should be aware Islam, by and large, does not want to assimilate into Australia and does not want to be part of Australia. However, they would like to take over Australia. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And it is not too far a stretch of the imagination to see how this is done. Because armed with political correctness, they increase their power gradually until people accept that, then a little bit more. And this insidious creeping is, I think, very, very dangerous. Now, I think Australia can defend itself as a nation if we have the right government policies. But it's very difficult when we are continually getting betrayed by the governments we've had. Oh,
A Muslim just coming.
no, he's not actually a Muslim. He obviously doesn't obey me because I told him to stay outside.
You stay there.
Right. Now, I must warn you, he can be very savage. If anyone heckles, he bites.
I'll see it all.
So, where do we go? What do we do? Well, I think we've got to get control of the politicians. How do we get control of politicians? They're a law unto themselves. That's not quite true. They're a law unto their parties. Every politician knows that the party can get him any day of the week. The party can get him, but you, the voter, can only get him once every 12 months, and once every year, election rather, and then he's got a 50-50 chance. So they are no longer frightened of the voters, and there's certainly no concern for the voters in most cases. I think the way we control the politicians is through the taxation system. I just want to put it to you. Now, I can tell you this will never happen because of vested interests. But I've given the matter a lot of thought, and I think the best taxation system we can have, the one that will protect Australia as a nation, as an economy, protect our culture, is return the power to the people via this taxation process. And what it is, it's a system called it's called various things. The United Nations is proposing it to fund itself automatically, which of course would be a terribly bad thing to do. And so far, no countries seem keen on giving the United Nations the funds to be a power unto itself. It can still be controlled to some extent by money it gets from sponsor nations. But this tax system I'm proposing would immediately stop all income tax. There would be no income tax whatsoever. In fact, there would be no other taxes, because if you levy every outlay in Australia, from toothbrushes to funerals, at 0.045 cents in the dollar, you can replace all other taxes. And that would be an enormous benefit to the economy. Upwardly mobile middle-class workers would find their tax bills reduced from some 30 to 50,000 a year, in some cases, down to about $7,000 to $9,000 a year. Be an enormous benefit on the basis that I believe that the individual is better able to spend his money than have the government spend it for him. Now, there are opponents to this scheme. One of them is politicians, because if you had this scheme, there would no longer be any tax deductibility, and the government couldn't buy favours by making certain situations tax exempt. For instance, I find it extremely frustrating that the Greens are largely tax exempt, when I think the Greens are a real threat to our national identity. Now, governments won't like that because they won't be able to provide largesse, and people forget when they think they're going to get a quick win that it's their money anyway. They seem to forget that very, very quickly. If the government wanted to fund something, would have to say to the public, this is what we want to do, and we will raise this tax at whatever percentage in the dollar, and there are people who can work that out very, very accurately. And I think the Australian people will, if they think a project is worthwhile enough, pay a fraction more than otherwise. Now, the other thing about this tax is the only tax I know of that the rich cannot avoid. Every other tax, they will avoid it somehow or other. They're even happy to pay tax experts what they would otherwise pay in tax to avoid it for them. So I think this sort of taxation needs to be really considered. Has another benefit, because you could incorporate into it revenue to run a state. The state would have to say how much it thinks it's needs to run, and that can be put into the equation. And this money is taken out automatically to the banks. So you can abolish the tax department. There will be no need for it to exist with all this corruption. It will be done at the banks, and it will be done immediately. So the money will be in a continuous stream, not sort of a yearly dump of money. Now, I think that states' rights are very important. And it's interesting when you see the parallels between Australia and the United States. States' rights are becoming a big issue there, because the federal government over there is an ever-growing guerrilla that's just taking in, way outside the Constitution, all sorts of things unto itself. And it is going to lead in my view, to bloodshed if it is not corrected. Just on that point, the federal government has already murdered one person. It's got heaps of people in jail. There's two, a father and a son, in jail for backburning on federal land. They had federal land adjacent to their property, fire burning down on it, so they let it backfire. It burned something like 120 acres, and they got 5 years jail for it. Now, I've actually done the same thing in Australia on several occasions. On one occasion, there were hundreds of thousands of acres worth. And I didn't worry me because I wanted to stop the fire from consuming my stock. But I thought it was absolutely bizarre. When I made inquiries in America, they said, oh, it's getting worse and worse. Australia will go down that road if we are not very careful. I mean, remember, we were already in jail. We've already put in jail a farmer. It's a technicality. He was actually put in jail for contempt of court because the court told him he wasn't allowed to clear his own land. So he ignored the court and he ended up in jail for it. And he said when he got out of jail he was going to clear his land. He's out of jail now, and so far I don't think the Commonwealth's taken any, or that in this case it's the state have taken any action against him. This gets back to a very important issue called property rights. Now, in our schools we teach that democracy stems from ancient Greece. In my view, there wasn't much democracy in ancient Greece, certainly not if you're a slave. Democracy really started when it started in Britain and in Holland in the 15th century, when they started to get rights from the Crown in return for cash. So they had freehold title, and that freehold title became very, very important. And it's very important today. And if you see freehold title eroded, it is a sign of centralisation and creeping socialism, in my view, moral decay. It's an issue in which it's very easy to divide the population, because most workers, the only asset they acquire in their life is their house, perhaps their car. But that house is very, very important to them, and the freehold rights of that should be absolutely protected. Now, we have already seen in Australia where we say to farmers, you can't clear your land. In my view, what we should say to farmers is, we don't want you to clear your land, but if you insist on clearing it, we'll pay you not to, or we'll buy it off you. But just to say to them, you will not clear the land, is a breach of their property rights, and I think it's something that ought to be looked at very, very seriously. Now, taxation, property rights, state rights are all bound up in this issue of our freedom. And we must be looking constantly in all directions, including behind us. Quite how we do that I haven't worked out yet, but it means you're going to turn around pretty often. It's apathy that lets these things happen. Now, I'll give you an example. In America, they had a president at one time. He declared that America was going to go metric. Made a presidential decree they were going metric. Within less than a year, there was such a raucous, such an outcry, they went back to their previous measurements and they don't show any sign of moving again. That was indication of people power. Now, if people use their power, they can win. Nothing frightens politicians like people power. So where we see these things happening, we should be vocal about them. If it means writing a letter to the paper, and I know about this, how depressing it is when your letters don't get published. And I doubt there's anyone who's had more letters not published than me, but it still has an impact. People see it in the newspapers, people say, oh, I wouldn't print that sort of stuff, but it rings a chord somewhere. And I think, arduous as it is, we have to keep making this case. Now, if we were to write, and this is Dennis McCormick's idea, on top of all our ballot papers, stop immigration, believe me, the Commonwealth government would stop it. Just like they stopped development in Tasmania when we wrote on the ballot papers, ban the dams. Now, I actually wrote ban the dam on the paper because I hadn't given the matter a lot of thought. For Kerr today, I certainly wouldn't be putting it on, because have a look at what it did for Tasmania. It crippled an already damaged economy. It didn't really save anything because it was a hydroelectric dam. Once the dam was full, the river would have continued to run. But it did force Tasmania to put an extension cord underneath the sea there and get coal from the Yallourn powerhouse, which is the dirtiest power in the world, dirtiest power in Australia. So I don't quite know what that did to the environment. That's a fact. But that was the great achievement of banning the dam, to make Victoria use the dirtiest power and fuel in Australia. And it'll go on, other things will come to mind. All these migrants tend to concentrate in our city areas or large towns. You don't find a lot of them in the bush. I mean, the bush, Australian bush, was developed by Scottish, English and Irish people. They're the ones that were stupid enough to go out in the bush and work their guts out in a very hostile climate. Now they tend to be disregarded these days in favour of we're now a multicultural society. I maintain we're not, and I've said if we had an election tomorrow, if we had a referendum on it, and I'm a great believer in referenda. I think we should have referenda questions attached to every election to put some control on government.
Graeme, excuse me, governments won't. The people we've got in power now don't like that, do they? Because they're asking, you said every 5 years, we're all stupid, we think we're in a democratic society, and we have that one vote every 5 years and say, well, we're giving you people our vote, our power, and away they go, doing what they like.
Yes.
Yes? So having a referendum, I think that's the greatest thing out, especially on key issues. But governments, and the other thing I'd like you to answer, because it's something I don't know, you've been in politics all the years, is the United Nations. You know, here we are with multiculturalism. I don't believe it's the everyday politician that we've got in Parliament or whatever. I reckon they're dictated because we've signed. Is it true agreements with the United Nations? If we don't, go down this path, you're not going to get this much from whoever we borrow money from.
Well,
I don't know.
We don't get anything from the United Nations. Those things don't carry any weight till they're legislated in Australia, and that's where the danger is. Politicians go overseas and agree to them. They have absolutely no basis until we legislate here. And you get, we must legislate because we signed this agreement with the United Nations. Tough luck. I think the United Nations is very, very dangerous. I see it as serving very little useful purpose other than, I think you would have to concede that United Nations Health has done some useful work, and I think Save the Children have also done some useful work. But generally, they can be done without a formal United Nations. And there again, if you had a vote in Australia, do you want to be part of the United Nations or not? And with its necessary explanation, I think the vote would go against it.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying, the ramifications of us getting out, like you said, because the average voter doesn't know that we've signed.
Yeah, well, I just think what's going to be interesting is what happens in the British referendum on staying in Europe. Because the power of the advertising to stay with Europe has been overwhelming. But I'm told that the polls neck and neck, and they think that the exits may in fact be slightly ahead. I hope they are, because it will fulfil one of my father's prophecies, that United Nations, that we will only be part of Europe for less than 50 years. He's a little bit out in his timing, but I think that is coming, and I think it'll be a good thing. I think it will be another source of argument in the world, another source to be consulted. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that election goes, given that massive coverage. Go back to Pauline Hanson's elections. When she first started the party, we were trying to get Australia First going. She had, according to an Australian journalist, $2.5 billion worth of free advertising. We had to pay for everything we got, and we couldn't come anywhere near that, of course. You know, we were down in the hundreds of dollars. So it generally works. However, there are some bright spots. In Australia, the situation has been you cannot get a referendum passed if it's opposed by one major party. It won't be carried the referendum. Well, in recent times, we've heard the last two referenda were supported by all the political parties, and they still failed. So I think people were starting to wake up. That's not what they wanted. One was to include local government in the Constitution. Why on earth we want to put local government in the Constitution, I've no idea. Local government is today the most corrupt form of any government. And I don't agree with council amalgamations, because I think you should be small enough so that you can keep real scrutiny on them. So the people's wisdom, in my view, is better than the view of both major parties. And I forget what the other... Oh yes, the other one was to extend the size of the parliament. Now the reason for this was Hawke had made so many promises to his buddies to get him a seat in parliament. But there are only so many seats in parliament. And they brought a bill into parliament to increase the size of the House of Reps, but not the Senate. So they're going to dilute that ratio. They were told that that was unconstitutional, couldn't be done. They then decided they would increase the House of Reps and the Senate, which was in many cases already overrepresented, particularly if you take a small state like South Australia or Tasmania. That was put to a referendum and they got a resounding no vote. That they could break the nexus. And so we've had this enlargement of Parliament. And, you know, it's getting to a stage where if you espouse strongly in public places views against multiculturalism, they will use the law against you. It's gradually becoming, started off as political correctness. It's now getting to a stage where they're going to make it illegal to criticise multiculturalism.
Actually, Graeme.
Many cases, too many cases. There are some United Nations things that, like law of the sea, which you have to have an international body for. But when it comes to social work, now I've got a friend who actually used to tender for United Nations work, And he gave up, and I asked him why. He said, he said, he's so corrupt. He said, you won't get any United Nations work unless you're part of the club. But he said, if you do get it, it'll be absolutely top dollar. Then he said, I suppose you have to pay some of that in kickbacks. That was a guy who'd been out in the field actually working the United Nations, and I think it's absolutely right. I've seen how they operate in various places. They are very well, their staff are very well funded. I think they're a problem, but they're not a problem that is so big that a sovereign government cannot take on if it wants to. Now, sovereign governments should not have any will of their own. They should only have the will of the people. And I think we need every opportunity to make that will apparent to them. Now, you say we can't get on the media, and that's absolutely right, I know. But, as I say, we stopped the dams in Tasmania because so many people wrote on their ballot papers, stop the dams. So, referenda don't need to be legal and binding to have influence on government. Governments look at that trend. And if the same number of people were to write stop immigration, and I've had so many people say to me, if you put stop immigration, your vote will be invalid. I said, it will not be. And I've actually had that verified by the electoral department. Providing you don't sign it, providing you're not identifiable, and you don't want to be identified, you want it to be the voice of every man of both sexes. I think it can work, but Facebook will work too. If we can get masses of people on Facebook, it will work. Now, I'm hoping to get a blog up on Facebook, and I'm hoping to be challenged by all the zealots that monopolise the media now. I'm hoping to get threatened legally, because my time of life, there's nothing they can do to me. I mean, I will survive jail.
I think in this country now, what we've definitely lost is the right to free speech. That's what we've lost, because the media won't print free speech. You can't get on the radio and say anything, because as soon as you talk to a producer of what you want to speak about, she'll say, we're not covering that subject. Or that's an iffy subject, or that might hurt, that might hurt people, so we're not going to go there. Well, if you haven't got the media, you haven't got anything.
Back to the free speech is very, very important. So important I omitted to mention it. But free speech will only exist as long as we practice it. Now they found in the Constitution a guarantee of free speech. God knows where they found it, because I've read the Constitution, I can't find it, but the High Court's declared that. And the law in Australia is what the High Court says it is. I think free speech has to be protected, and I intend to speak very freely on the blog until they have to do something about me. But, you simply have to keep trying with free speech, because it will disappear. I mean, these acts which say political correctness is inhibiting free speech.
Stop them.
And I think, well, he's stopping it, and certainly we've got to do that. Now, one of the things I meant to say in the defence area, defence is important because it gives Australia the opportunity to build up homegrown industries which cannot be sold overseas. Now, I think our defence expertise should be looked at very much in the drone area. I think drones are important to the defence of Australia, and they have lots of other interests. We were the first country in the world to have guided planes with the Jindabyne. Then we just stopped. We could be at the forefront of that area. The jobs there are enormous.
Graham, we had that, but the Yanks took it. I worked on the civil side of defence. I don't want to say too much more than that, but we had all that. And the Yanks grabbed it, they grabbed the people, And
Yeah, but they didn't.
We have no more.
They didn't have to. The government had no will. But I can tell you, Kim Beazley was the worst Minister of Defence we've ever had. Now, I went to see Beazley over the submarine issue. And I said, look, here's evidence of corruption in the submarine tender. I laid it out for him, and he went white. When I say went white, I'm not using that as a figure of speech. He went white.
What, a man that eats that much went white?
Yeah. Anyway, then he blustered and said, oh, no, it's a coincidence. So I went to the Ombudsman, who didn't want to take it, but I forced the Ombudsman who agreed to look at it. So the Ombudsman, next thing he phoned me up and said, oh, I've got 7 tonne of paper in my office, what am I going to do with it? It wasn't 7 tonne, but it was at least 3 tonne. And they just dumped it and said, well, there it is. But I went through it, I found the relevant parts. And so he found that there was collusion in the tendering, but it happened at a fairly low level, i.e. a parliamentary committee, which put us in perspective. But he didn't know whether it went up or down. Well, of course it did. It went right the way up and right the way down. However, that forced the government to get rid of their preferred tender, which was the Germans. And I thought, good, there'll be a new tender. Instead, they just took the Swedish, which their own thing has said the Swedes are very innovative, but too risky. Right outside the terms of the request for tender. So we got the Swedish thing, which of course was an absolute banana. And the only reason it's been workable at all is because Australian technology did a lot to decrease its noise. Even worse than that was the helicopter. We were having a helicopter acquisition, of which the Black Hawk was one of the tenderers, as was the Super Puma, the French one, and the British Westland W30. The Army came before our committee, I was on the Defence Committee, and said they wanted the W30. It didn't fulfil all their requirements, but it came far closer than anything else, and that's the one they wanted. When we were speaking to Westland says, you've got a tremendous capacity out here. We've had a look at your aircraft factory, and he said it's as good as anything in the world. It's better than anything we've got, and we've never seen anything better in America. And he said, if we do this joint venture with Australia, we will transfer all our technology. So in 5 years, you'll know as much as us about building helicopters. That was the only company that offered a free exchange of all their technology. The only thing the Black Hawk had going for it was Rupert Murdoch on the board of Boeing, or Black Hawk. And it was the oldest helicopter. It was the most difficult to fly. The reason it was difficult to fly was the fuel wasn't underneath the centre of gravity. So as the fuel load shifted, you had to have a little computer which kept changing the tabulator at the back of the plane, and that gave a lot of problems. Man, that's the one we got.
I won't be sitting in that helicopter any day.
Well, we coupled with that, the Air Force, the government was at the same time taking the control of the helicopters from the Air Force and giving them to the Army. We had our helicopters grounded when the Air Force had warehouses full of parts. When there was just strong government could have fixed that in a flash, but no one did. Now, when we refused to take the W30, Westland went broke. They sold it to the Italians, and the Westland W30 is now regarded to be the best medium-lift helicopter in the world. The Italians have done very well with it. That was something we should have had here because we could have exported from here. Just on that, I was on the China Friendship Group at the time, and I said to the Chinese, do you want to buy some helicopters? Helicopters? Oh, what sort of helicopter? I said, Westland W30. Oh, very good, very good. We tell you tomorrow. Tomorrow came and they said, oh, look, trial order, we only want 200. We were buying 75. I said, that's all right. 2 days later, they came back and said, if you let us build the engines for all the helicopters, we can take a lot more. I said, all right. So I phoned up Rolls-Royce and said, now, look, what's the score? How about Chinese engines under licence? And they said, no trouble at all. They already build our engines under licence and they are entirely up to spec. We have no problem at all with that. We'll guarantee you that now. We'll have to consult the French, who are the other part of the engine, and but that'll be no trouble. So I went back and said, yeah, that'll be no trouble. Could not get any traction in Australia. Tried the unions, didn't want to know. Tried the media, didn't want to know. Spoke about it in Parliament, no one cared. And Beattie certainly didn't care. And that's just 2 examples of Beattie's disasters as Minister of Defence.
Didn't care in a general sense when he was the member for Swan.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry,
how long has he sat over there in America as our ambassador?
what's it, 9 years, isn't it?
So what's the magic picture he's got on him? Someone with a goat,
Big man.
obviously. But how did he get a position like that?
Oh, jobs for the boys, obviously. You know, it's government change. They'll record the existing ambassador and put him in there. It's a nice perk.
And he slipped on some ice over there and didn't die because of the size of him.
Yeah, well, he rolled. Yeah, but not my favourite person.
Oh, Graeme, just got another question here.
Graeme, you've described the tax system, but I have a pretty good idea of what you are referring to, and you didn't name it. I don't know whether you had any reason. You've mentioned referendum and how good it is, and I certainly agree. And I'm pretty sure we've spoken in the past about a name for that too. And the other query, I could mention it, but I don't know whether you had reason for not mentioning it. On these international agreements, I've never pondered, is it just an act of Parliament that we could reverse those decisions, those United Nations agreements we've endorsed?
We can reverse them, yeah. Governments can reverse them, yeah. Citizens-initiated referenda, I think, is a very useful tool. I've been given the matter a lot of thought in recent years, and I think the public have to be much better educated before we bring this forward. We must get people interested in referenda. Now, if you can't get... In Australia, the government is the only people who call a referendum. South Australia tried to get it in that the people could call it. The politicians thought, no, couldn't trust the people, so they're the only ones. So we might have to look at de facto referendum. And these are really, I suppose, opinion polls. And to see if we can get some of those up. Now, the electronic measure is one place where you can. I don't know how, but I'm sure you can.
Tax system.
Yeah.
You didn't give it a name. Is there any reason, or...?
Well, it's hard to find a name for it. The United Nations has a name for it. It's called the...
We spoke before about a debit tax.
Yeah, well, it is a debit tax, yeah. It is a debit tax, yeah, but it's a specific debit tax. Mind you, this has been tried, and there was such a outcry from people, I don't know why, because I think it's probably the least invasive tax of any tax. I've had people say to me, oh, they put it, they'll even put it on funerals. I said, yeah, they put it on everything. Fresh vegetables, everything. It's still a much better way of raising the money that's needed, and governments need money, but it gives you control over how much money they get and what they do with it. Yeah, you had a question, sorry.
When John Howard allowed dual nationality to allow Murdoch to be American and Australian, I reckon it was very detrimental to Australia. And you're talking about Australians, but how many Australians do we have? Because you've got Syrian Australians, Chinese Australians. Are they Australian or Chinese? And to have dual nationality, you've got no loyalty to this country.
Yeah, I used to have two nationalities. I used to have a British passport as well as an Australian passport. I had to denounced my British citizenship because they were talking about making it illegal to be in Parliament if you had two passports. They brought in the legislation, and it was aimed entirely at the British. That's what it was aimed at. I might add, metrification. The Labor Party brought in metrification without any consultation with the people. That was brought in. Primarily, the objective was to move us away from British alliance to a Swedish alliance. Sweden was the country of choice of the Labor Party at that time. Now, it cost $2.5 billion at the time. That was an awful lot of money in its day. And, you know, I've spoken to lots of people in industry and they said, well, we use both, still use both. And a lot of people are, you know, in the fine machining, still working for ours.
So how many politicians then have dual nationality?
Well,
Because
they changed it so that it didn't apply to Greeks, because the Greeks had a rule that you only hold Greek nationality. And there was a couple of other countries, so it's something that's disregarded now.
Because
You
there
see-
was the One Nation lady who got into Parliament. Her name was Heather Hills. And the media attacked her because she had dual nationality. And she had to resign. And then it came out later, a lot of politicians have got dual nationalities.
Yeah. That really is a cultural thing. See, I don't think it matters much people have got dual nationality as long as the culture's the same. So British with dual nationality really don't matter. In fact, the Constitution, our Constitution says, and it's never been amended, that to be a member of the Australian Parliament you have to be a British citizen. So I think it's something you look at, but it's in overall that's a fairly minor thing.
Not if you've got Syrian Australians, because they're going over there and fighting. And they're saying, when they go into the Middle East to fight, they're saying, oh, the Australians. But their alliances are with Syria or wherever.
Yeah, I don't think they're saying Australians. We're saying that they're Australians. I think by going over there to fight for ISIS, they're proving they're not Australians. And I don't agree with the government. I think we should let them all go. We should make sure they don't come back. And
Stop calling them Aussies.
And stop
certainly causing them Aussies. Certainly stop calling them Aussies, yeah.
Send those Afghanistani men back and put them in uniform instead of our boys dying.
And I
Because they're
recall too
gutless, these
when
Muslim men.
Bill Hayden was in power, he was the leader of the Labour Party, and he was saying we all should become Euro-Asian. That was his call. So we all got to become Euro-Asian. So
Bill Hayden learned a lot. When he became foreign minister, the deal he did with Hawke, that okay, he'd stand down in favour of Hawke, but he wanted the foreign ministership. He was a very good foreign minister. And he said to me, well, he said, in this business you can't trust anyone, but you can trust the Brits a lot more than you can trust anyone else. He changed a lot of his views. Euro-Asian, that was his way of pandering to what was the demands of the Labor Party at the time. I don't think it was a view he held with any great depth of feeling. I've got a feeling I missed one of your points
about the director.
about,
Just the, I think it was just the debit tax. I was going to mention about then, following the discussion comment there, I was under the impression, I don't know whether it's still the case or not, but when people swear an oath of allegiance, they have to swear it to a country, and in our case Australia. If a person who swears an oath of allegiance, if they're citizenship of two countries, how do we, the people, know where their allegiance is?
well, clearly you don't. You don't. But I think you can make a fairly educated guess. What they say, follow the money. And they change their allegiance in many cases for economic gain, security. They are the beneficiaries. It's a problem. You know, I'm aghast at those people I see get elected. You can bet that in many cases the woman in the family will never ever learn to speak English. You know, they say this is multiculturalism, all cultures are equal. How can they be equal when you actually look at the treatment of women under Islam? Now, I've had this argument with Islamic women, and I think to myself, how can you possibly hold these obviously stupid views? But people do. Hold a lot of stupid views, yeah.
Another point in the Australian newspaper recently, I think it was $800 million was going overseas pensions. What's it, 800 million? Yeah. We're spending outside pensions. The highest were Italian and Greece. It's where they're going to, pensions. But a lot of them left because they had a better standard of living back in Greece.
Oh, sure, yeah. Sure, and quite frankly, I think as a growing nation, we can probably handle that. I think that's about the same as Australia gets from Britain.
But Britain don't pay the full amount, I don't think, with the pensions. There's always a bit of it.
I think I think the British top-up comes to something that they're talking about cutting it back.
And I think we owe about $1 billion a month we're paying on interest here. I think it's that high. 12 billion a year.
Look, people who go overseas and take their pension with them, if they fall ill and treated in hospital overseas, much cheaper for us to pay that than...
I think Australia's stopping it now, actually.
Yeah, we're talking about stopping, but I think if they're getting treated overseas, it's a lot cheaper for us than bringing them back and treating them.
There seems to be a lot of money goes out of this country overseas. People sort of use this country and then they take it out.
Well, yes, that's true, but that happens to lots of countries. The outflow in America is absolutely huge.
Because we lived in Africa one time and the money we took out had to be recorded in the back of our passport. We were only allowed to take a certain amount.
Yes, I know a lot of people that converted their money to diamonds in Africa and bought those out. If you had that sort of money. Anyone got any more questions?
I've just got one that you...
Yeah, just a second.
I was interested in what you had to say about earning back farming property. I was with a career firefighter for 31 years. I've been retired since 2002. And we hardly ever lost a house in my day. The fires were just as hot, just the same. Because the first thing we used to look at was earning back, and now they're not allowed to do it. Because they've got people up the top that are against burning back, and I'm still with the fire brigade in voluntary capacity, and I talk to fire everywhere. And the thought is that, or the opinion is, that Yarloop would have been saved if they could have burned back early enough.
Oh, I've absolutely no doubt it could. Fortunately, I live in a part of Australia where the regulation and supervision isn't very high, and I wouldn't hesitate to burn back tomorrow. But a lot of that is coming, from America, and it's the environmentalists.
That's right.
Burning back will affect, well, it's amazing. In nature, it's always happened, and these animals have always survived. So that environmental power is becoming very, very onerous. Look, I just wanted to say this. The saying seems a bit self-promoting, but I think with the 1994 election, the Greens said publicly that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party were so similar they didn't know who to give their preferences to. the Labor Party got onto me and said, this is you, this is all you're doing, because I was continually running a campaign against the Greens. And so I said, don't be ridiculous, they're just setting you up so you'll give them more things. I said, of course they're going to give you the preferences. They've got nowhere else to go. Well, sure enough, 2 weeks later, they announced that reluctantly they were going to give the preference to the Labor Party, except in Kalgoorlie, where I was so evil I had to be put last. So the media immediately came to me for a quote and said, oh, that's fair enough. I always tell everyone else to put them last, so that's fair enough. But I'll win anyway. But the Labor Party said, no, one all in. And they sent down John Caldell, the secretary of the Labor, Assistant Secretary of the Labor Party. They sent him down to negotiate with the Greens. I happened to be in Perth that day. He was only away for a couple of hours, and he came back like the proverbial cat that swallowed the canary, and said, it's all fixed, no problem, it's all fixed. I said, that's very clever, John, how did you do that? He said, I've known them for years, they're all the old comrades that used to run the Communist Party and the Trots. He said, now they run the Greens. Make no mistake about it, that is where the roots of the Greens is. It's an authoritarian politics. After all, the first green movement in the world was started by Adolf Hitler. And the only difference between communists and fascists is a worldwide canvas, whereas fascism works on a local one, whereas communism works on a worldwide one. But otherwise, it's exactly the same authoritarian dogma.
Okay,
What happened to your glass of water you stopped?
I was drinking it. I think your dog wanted to have a guzzle.
Yeah.
But I might have to...
Yeah.
And you can ask Graeme some more stuff while he's here too, if you want afterwards, but...
Yeah.
Graeme, I have a question, mate, to do... you obviously have considerable knowledge of things affecting Aborigines in Western Australia. I'm just wondering what you might have to say there about the situations such as with closing down the remote communities and the wastage that goes on in that type. You called it previously the Aboriginal industry. Can you sort of enlighten us a bit about that?
Well, there's been a big outcry in the paper about fellas made a lot of money out of running an Aboriginal community. Nothing's changed. I know that years ago when I first went into Parliament, I was appalled. And it was obvious to me that the quickest way to become a millionaire was to become a storekeeper or a bookkeeper or a community advisor in an Aboriginal community. But I'll guarantee you this, the chairman of the Aboriginal community would have been a chairman, a succession of them would have been getting kickbacks from that. I think there has to be much greater control. I think the closing down communities has got to be done very selectively, but it's an option that needs to be considered. And I think we have to look about how we're going to improve the outcome for Aborigines. Well, I know how to do it. We'll get them recognised in the referendum, in the constitution. Do you think that'll do it?
No.
Of course it won't. It'll make things worse. You know, the only thing is accountability. And I remember an Aboriginal saying to me, your welfare is making us all dependent. It's stopping it, it's killing our culture. You're making it dependent on your welfare. And I think we've got to have the courage to attack some of these things. There are Aboriginals out there who want something done, but they have exactly the same problem that we have within the industry and within the government recognising them. So I missed you. You had a question over there?
That's all right now.
Well, how about you, Graeme? We can grab you afterwards. So can everyone give a round of applause for Graeme today? Because I think we can grab him. But Graeme, before you do go, I had some of these. When you're driving back to Kalgoorlie today, are you?
Yeah.
You might. I don't know if you've got a set of these for the side of your car to put on the set of Australian flag on the side of your car. They're legal apparently, so there you go.
Yeah. Well, I don't. So
There you go.
In China.
Well, unfortunately,
almost certainly, yeah.
Unfortunately, the people will be made in China soon the way it's going. So thanks, Graeme. I appreciate that.
One of the things I liked about America You pick up a hat like yours in America, and it's not made in China.
Made in Mexico.
No, it's made in the US, made in the USA. Some of them could be made in Mexico.
Mexico's there, China.
Thanks, Graeme. Well, before you do go to date, I'm going to have two gentlemen.